Good evening down under in Australia. Here it's still morning, and frankly, many of us have not been able to sleep much in the past few days, definitely not last night. So, with your indulgence, I will give a very brief update on the election results and try to do an analysis. I think we would be better served if we used more of our time for questions and answers and less for my analysis, very simply because many of us and many of the pundits are still trying to digest the election results. And whatever I say at this point is going to be very much a question of speculation and guesswork. So, what I'll try to do with your assistance is give you an update on the results as we know them, make some comments on why the results are a bit of a surprise to many Israelis and people abroad who care very much about Israel, highlight some of the key characteristics of the campaign, and give a few words about where we go from here. So let me start with an update of the election results. I understand that you have been uh, following these very closely, but at the moment, the absolute latest results give the Likud 30 seats, the Zionist Union, headed by Herzog and Livni, 24 seats. The third largest party is the Joint Arab List with 14 seats, which is very much a real and a significant shift in Israeli politics. And then we go to Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid with 11, 10 seats to Kulanu. That is Moshe Kahlon. Moshe Kahlon is unquestionably the kingmaker, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We have 8 seats for the Jewish Home Party of Naftali Bennett. That's a drop of 1/3 in his electoral power. 7 seats for Shas, 6 seats each for United Torah Judaism and for uh, uh, Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu, and Meretz at the moment is down to 4 seats. These are almost complete election results. What has not yet been counted are those who voted early, emissaries abroad, and the votes of the Israel Defense Forces. That's roughly about 9% of the vote. Definitely will not change the results. It will maybe add one here, detract one there, and will by Thursday evening, tomorrow evening, we should know the full results with also the distribution of whatever leftovers according to the agreements. Now, how you analyze these results is a matter of taste. Uh, some people say, do you want the good news or do you want the bad news? Depending where you're coming from, obviously. Let me make it very clear. This is a victory for the Likud and specifically for Mr. Netanyahu, who barely a week ago was actually tailing in the polls. But frankly, it's less of a victory for Israel's right than one would imagine when one sees the results, the raw results. And let me explain why. All the right wing parties That means the Likud, the Jewish Home Party, Israel Beitenu, and the two ultra-Orthodox parties do not have a majority in the Knesset. They come to 57 and only 57, falling actually 4 short of the needed 61 for a majority. The left parties have actually gained in this election between Meretz, the Zionist Union, and the Joint Arab List. There are 42 seats. And the difference is the 21 seats of the two center parties, Yesh Atid and Kulanu. Mr. Netanyahu will form the next government, and he will be heavily dependent on the key kingmaker of these elections, who is Moshe Kachalon. I think we can suggest with a great deal of certainty that Moshe Kachalon will be the next Minister of Finance. That's the ticket he ran on. That's what he wants. Is what will be. That will give Netanyahu, with all the right-wing parties, a coalition of 67 and a very strong and vibrant opposition of 53. My one question mark to myself in this analysis is what Yair Lapid will do. Basically, his electorate is a center-left electorate. He actually siphoned votes off from Herzog. He's not built for the opposition. He may be tempted to go into government, but even though this is a Netanyahu victory, I think it's really, really critical to understand that the left has gained strength. And looking at the numbers, if you count the center and the left together, actually center-left has a majority in the new Knesset, even though it will not make up the government. The election results are a surprise for many, many Israelis, many, many observers. We thought that the elections were much closer and possibly tilting even to the center left. I think the difference was, as has been very much a pattern in the Israeli elections during the last cycles, that in the very last 2-3 days before the actual ballot, there one or two major surprises occur that shift or tilt the results in one direction or another. Only in the last week has Mr. Netanyahu begun to campaign seriously, and since last Wednesday, Thursday, he literally blitzed the airways, the media, the social networks, and to a certain extent, the streets as well, with very vigorous campaigning, known, by the way, in Israel as a Gewalt campaign. Oh my God, we're about to lose, you have to save us, etc., etc. He did it very effectively. Unfortunately, if I may say so, he not only did it effectively, but even until during the day, during the vote yesterday, part of his messaging was on the verge of being quite racist. For example, in the middle of the day, he appeared on YouTube and on the networks calling to potential voters to come out and vote because the Arabs are swarming the polling stations and they might overcome us. I don't want to say what some people think of this kind of campaigning, but it was extremely successful. And I think it's important for everybody to understand how successful indeed Mr. Netanyahu is proven to be as a campaigner. Let's go a little beyond this and try to analyze what has actually led up to this result and where we stand. Some characteristics of the campaign are very, very important. The first is this campaign was the most animated, lively, engaged campaign in recent memory. It was very acrimonious as well. In some cases, it was an ugly campaign, but it was not a campaign of apathy or indifference. It was very clear from the beginning and during the course of the campaign a direct competition between two visions of what Israel is about, a vision of Israel as an open, democratic, tolerant, and diverse society, and an image of Israel that was nationalistic, introspective, in many senses, ethnocentric. And these two various camps, with lots of people in the middle that didn't want to decide one way or the other, is what propelled the election campaign throughout. Um, Having said that, in many senses, again, if you call the rise in the number of seats of the center left as an achievement, it was an achievement. But since it's a loss because center left will not make up this government, then in a sense, the more nationalistic, introspective view has succeeded, and we cannot ignore that fact. The second element of the campaign that's very important is that this campaign was primarily, not entirely, but primarily about bread and butter issues. At least a third of the Israeli population is below the poverty line or just near the poverty line. Income inequalities are immense, and therefore, people really, really feel that their situation of their pocket is critical and needs resolution from the government. The Likud until recently didn't address these issues, but I would argue very strongly today that what tipped the difference towards the Likud is Netanyahu's ability to convince a very skeptical right wing public that he will do a better job in the future. On that score, we have to wait and see. And the third factor I want to raise about the dynamics of the campaign itself is that a lot of this campaign was not conducted by politicians. It was conducted by citizens talking to each other in the streets, mobilizing people. I don't recall civil society on all sides of the political spectrum so closely engaged as during this election campaign. So there are certain characteristics, there are certain elements and issues that will continue and become a very important part of what takes place from here on in. Let me continue for a few moments to speculate about what will take place in the next few weeks and to raise some thoughts about what all this means for Israel, for progressives who care about Israel, and for Jews throughout the world. If I read the situation this morning correctly, and please forgive me, but everybody is a little bleary eyed, and it may not be the best time to try and give a lucid analysis. Netanyahu will form a narrow government. He may attempt to bring Yair Lapid on board, but I see no signs of a national unity government, quite the contrary. So we are in for another period of Netanyahu rule with a very right wing religious coalition. And that's point number one, with all that that means. There will also be a very, very vigorous opposition in the Knesset. And for the first time, an Arab party, I'm not sure if it will maintain its cohesiveness over the long run, but at the moment, an Arab party that has proven that it is a political force to be reckoned with, and frankly, has gained a legitimacy by the voters well beyond anything that the Arab community in Israel has known up to now. So that's the immediate picture. But the issue elements are perhaps more important. Let me attempt to just tease out some of the things that one should pay attention to. The first thing is Netanyahu, whether he likes it or not, is going to have to pay much more attention to domestic issues. He promised that to his voters in the last few days. He repeated that last night and this morning here in Israel, and he knows full well that he will not have any margin for maneuverability if it does not directly address housing, welfare, education, and health. This will be, excuse me, a more domestically oriented government. The second point that is very clear to many of us is that Israel, under these circumstances, will become more isolated internationally. It's not difficult to project that, but I don't have to comment greatly on the fact, excuse me, a little tea does some good under these circumstances. Israel's isolation will grow, and there will be greater pressure from the international community and the West on Israel. The question is what all this means for the future shape of Israel. The two-state solution, something that Netanyahu rejected outright in the last few days, has a real question mark around it. And there will have to be some very deep thinking on where one goes from here. And the last point I'd like to make before I sip excuse me, some tea. Is that I think we can anticipate another round of elections and maybe some political engineering or redesign of our system within the next 2 years. Let me stop here, have some more tea, and listen to your questions. Thank you.
We're now going to take questions from the floor, questions that come in over webinar. I've got a roaming mic. Anybody have a question here?
Thank you for a very good speech, and well done for pursuing that with your cough there. I wanted to ask you just to reflect for a moment on the campaign conducted by Herzog. It seems to me, looking at it from a long way away, that he focused on the bread and butter issues, as you stated, without discussing the peace process much or the two-state solution at all. And it reminded me much of the campaign which Shelley Yachimovich conducted a few years ago. She seemed to do the same thing, just focusing on the economy. Isn't it the case that while the left focuses just on the economy and doesn't discuss the peace process, it gives the right total control over the narrative that there's nobody to talk to and that basically the two-state solution is impossible? Could you reflect on that for a moment, please?
Okay, I'll divide my answer into two parts because I would have a different interpretation of the first part of your question, and I would agree with you in thrust of the second part. This campaign was not the same campaign that Labor ran 2 years ago with Shelley Yachimovich at the helm. It was not the same campaign for several reasons. It was not only about social and economic issues, it was very much also about democracy, and it was also about Israel's international legitimacy and reaching some kind of accord with Israel's neighbors. So I think the comparison between Herzog's and Tzipi Livni, by the way, campaign this time, and Shelley Yachimovich's campaign 2 years ago, it is not entirely correct. It doesn't reflect what was taking place. Where I do agree with you very strongly is that Labor did not give hope in terms of moving the process along. What it promised is to try to move the process along. But in the last few weeks, Herzog repeated that there's not a partner at the moment. And as you would probably say in Australia, he waffled a little bit on presenting a very clear solution or direction for how to move forward on the, let's call it the peace front. Whether that hurt him or not electorally is something that we don't know. I'll stop here. That was a full stop.
The question here, Naomi, is what impact did Tzipi Livni have herself as a candidate in the rotation of Herzog? What impact do you think that had on the result overall, and I guess specifically Hatzioni's vote?
Because I'm not sure that was the question, but I'll answer your question. If it was Liam, I think I recognize your voice. Tzipi, look, This is a major achievement for the Labour Party. It went up from 15 to 24, maybe 25. We'll see at the end. It could not have been done without the collaboration, the Herzog-Livni collaboration. I think where it went a little off was the notion of the rotation that they had agreed upon and that they disavowed on the eve of the actual ballot. But I think the connection did not hurt labor, it actually helped labor. And don't forget, maybe I should have mentioned it before, the rules of the game changed in this election. There's a 3.25% threshold, okay, which favors larger parties. There will be only 11 parties in this Knesset, and you may think it's a lot, but for Israelis, it's actually the smallest number in quite some time. So Livni was an asset, and I think she will continue to be one.
We have another question from the floor. I don't think it's on. Okay, we have another question from the floor.
Naomi, thank you for again. I do feel sorry for you coughing there. Friend of mine in Israel has just texted me and said the way Netanyahu campaigned, it is the Putinization of Israel. The way he talked about foreign forces and the style was just like Putin, and therefore he's worried for Israeli democracy. Do you see this in such extreme terms, the Putinization of Israel?
I thought Putin disappeared for a while. Okay, thank you for the question, because many of you may note that I ducked the personality issue in my analysis up to now. I did it on purpose, by the way, because in many respects, this election was first and foremost a referendum on Mr. Netanyahu, not only on his policies, but frankly on his personality and very much on his style of leadership, which I've heard everything from Putinese to other things that I don't feel like mentioning at this point. At least in Israel, it's still morning. But having said that, unquestionably, these issues will not go away. They will not go away. If Mr. Netanyahu was known for, how should I put it, a fairly large ego up to now, after his success yesterday, I assume that will expand beyond recognition. But if I may, even a glimpse at his victory speech last night in front of the Likud is indicative. As you're probably aware, his wife has been under great public scrutiny. And I don't remember, and I'm not getting any younger, any instance in the past where the candidate for prime minister in a victory speech spent half the time kissing his wife on the mouth in front of obviously the fans gathered at the Likud headquarters last night. In other words, already the papers are beginning to talk about the victory of the royal couple, and they're talking about the prince, the two sons. etc., etc. Let's not take this too far, because frankly, on this point, Israelis have very little patience for over arrogance and lavish lifestyles, and they will continue to criticize the prime minister, and that criticism will not come only from the center and the left, it will also come from within his own ranks. So those who are very upset today should think very carefully, because I think it's safe to assume that this is Netanyahu's last term.
Thank you, Naomi. We have another question from the internet, which is, what role do you expect Lieberman to play in the government? And is it a similar one in the last one where he was foreign minister? And what impact do you think his comments about the role of Arab Israelis and questioning citizenship and loyalty will have in this government as well?
Okay, let me take the second part of the question first. So Lieberman ran, he took a very sharp turn to the right during the campaign. He really ran a campaign that was very, very difficult to digest in terms of the things it said about Arabs. He had some public televised encounters with Ayman Uda, the head of the Arab Party, really ugly, basically telling Ayman Uda that you Arabs are a fifth column and things of that sort. During the last 2 weeks, his entire campaign revolved around death sentences for terrorists and things of that sort. But so if anybody doubted that 2015 was a different variation on similar types of statements in the past, absolutely. Having said that, Lieberman this morning is already making noises. I'm not a shoo-in. You can't take me for granted, even though I only have 6 seats. You absolutely need me for the mathematics, and that, by the way, is correct. And I'm not sure where I want to go, etc., etc., etc. In other words, he's going to play very, very hard to get. I think we can assume that he's not going to be foreign minister. There's too much competition inside the Likud for who's going to be foreign minister, but he will be a factor. And how he'll play it out, I don't know. We cannot forget that there is a great deal of personal animosity between Netanyahu and Lieberman. To say that they dislike each other intensely is probably one of the greatest understatements that I can present to you. And that will be important as the coalition negotiations proceed and in the future.
Another question.
Maybe one more comment on Lieberman. I think what's clear is that Lieberman, perhaps even like Netanyahu, maybe has a political past, but I'm not sure if he has a political future, because frankly, his political base, which are Russian-speaking people, are fading away, and the younger Russian speakers are not voting for him.
Naomi, a question with regard to the Arab Israeli parties. Is the success of this party, and of course we saw quite a major increase in that, is that due solely to additional or more votes or more participation of the Arab Israelis in this election, or is there, as I've heard, Israeli non-Arabs that voted for these parties?
Okay, very good question. Thank you very much. Look, the participation rate in this election were the highest in about 20 years. They were 71.8% overall, in comparison to about 66.8% last time. Now, I've been searching all morning before I came here to talk to you for the Arab vote, and the best I could glean was that it wasn't as large as one would expect. But look, with the greatest participation rates ever in recent years, the joint list got 14 seats. That means, as a political move, it was not only forced, by the way, by Lieberman in a boomerang of his own making on the Arab parties, but it proved to be a real vote getter and a boost. And that should not be ignored. Now, I read very carefully what's behind your question. You're asking, are these Jewish votes or Arab votes? These are primarily, probably 98% votes of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. Let's be very clear about that. What I did do some point at about 4 a.m. is I checked the Jewish vote for the Arab list. I did it by location, by checking out various locations. I don't think when all the votes are counted, that it will come to much more than 6, 7, maybe even 5,000 votes. So it's not a result of a Jewish vote. This is an Arab electoral bloc with a lot of sympathy in left Jewish circles and some voters, but it's a handful. Let me give you the comparison to make the point. In the 2013 elections, about 8,000 of the votes for Hadash, the largest component in the joint Arab list, came from Jewish voters. 8,000 votes is about 30% of one seat. And when I finally get the final numbers, I don't think the Jewish vote for the joint list will be much greater than that.
Thank you, Naomi. We have another question from the webinar on a similar vein, which is what role you think the Arab parties will have in the opposition, and how much, particularly what their relationship might be with Meretz, where there was perhaps a surplus agreement floated. I think Ayman Udes was quoted by Bernie Avishai last week as saying that it was floated, and then Meretz said no, and then Meretz came back and said yes, and the Joint Arab List said no, and so what role do you think they'll play as part of the wider opposition?
Okay. I was somewhat involved in this attempt to redesign the excess vote deal that before the election, and it, for me, mostly highlighted some of the splits within the joint Arab list. Hadash and Ahmad Tibi's party, which is Ahmad Tibi, very much favored signing this agreement on excess votes with Meretz. The Islamic Party, which is the third component of the joint Arab list, didn't disagree, but Balad, which is very much an ultra-nationalist Palestinian Arab party, essentially vetoed the the agreement. Did it result in the loss of a mandate somewhere between Meretz and the Joint Arab List? I think so. But leaving that aside, because I think that whole process was a perfect case of cutting off your nose to spite your face. Everybody lost from not making the deal, and now people will begin to reanalyze it. What it does point out, this whole process, is two very important things. The Joint Arab List is a coalition of convenience, which is yet to coalesce into an active political power. It's going to take some time, and I'm not certain that the list will continue to work together, although my estimate now is that the success will actually bring the various parties together even more. They'll constantly argue with each other. That's a very Israeli trait, and I think we see it in the Arab Party. So that's number one. But the second point is even more important. It points to the fact that within the new rules of the game, there's going to be a re-examination of the party map and party distribution in general in the next little while. For example, an ideological party like Meretz, can it continue to exist? It barely passed the threshold, and mostly because, for strategic reasons, not ideological ones. Many voters of the left were afraid that if Meretz goes under the threshold, 4 seats, 4 mandates of the left will disperse into thin air. And therefore they voted for Meretz for strategic reasons, because they needed the support for the bloc, the center-left bloc. Now, does Meretz have to reconsider its way? Yes. To go to the other side, does the Bayit Yehudi, which lost over a third of its strength on the right, as an ideological party, can it continue to subsist with a 3.25 threshold? And if I know Lieberman, he'll ask for a 5% threshold. For that matter, can Lieberman's party succeed in surviving another election? There's going to be a lot of thinking about party alliances in the next little while. And frankly, from that point of view, the Arab list is very instructive because they've pointed a way of coming together without losing identity that other parties might follow in the future.
A question from the room.
Naomi, mentioned that the participation rate was...
Yes, I'm with you.
Okay. You mentioned, Naomi, that the participation rate was about 71%, and that was quite a high level.
71.8%. We don't have compulsory voting like in Australia.
I was about to say, in comparison with Australia, that's quite low. But given that that's a historic, or recently a historic high, and that there is no compulsory voting in Israel, to what extent does it mean that the electoral process and Knesset elections, parliament elections in Israel, are hostage to the right and the settler and the ultra-nationalist camp, because they are the ones who will consistently mobilise their supporters and get them out, as opposed to the rest of the country, which is one composed of supporters of people who will vote or not vote according to circumstances. I mean, to what extent is really this and Israel's future electoral fortunes hostage to the fact that the right and the settlers will get their people out. And for example, on this occasion, it seems that there was a real threat, of course, that they may lose power, and they did get out and vote.
Okay, I can't 100% answer that question because I didn't have the time to do what I love to do. I know some of you may think this is funny, but I actually analyzed the results almost polling station by polling station, definitely by where people live, et cetera, and I only have bare indications. I'll give you one example. Tel Aviv was heavily in favor of the Zionist Union, Meretz, etc. Likud did very poorly in Tel Aviv, but Likud did very well in Jerusalem. But there's some points that I think that we need to think about again. Number one, ironically, there will be fewer settlers in this Knesset than in the outgoing Knesset because Eli Yishai's party, Yachad, did not pass the threshold. That's good news, including Baruch Marzel, who is essentially the successor of Kahana in the Israeli political scene. Now, that's a settler-based party. It did not pass the threshold. Very, very close, but it didn't. Naftali Bennett's party, whose backbone are settlers, suffered quite a reduction in representation. And let's not forget that despite the right-wing move of the Likud in its entirety, inside the Likud, the very strong, almost rabid settler elements did not succeed in getting good spots on the list. For example, Feiglin is essentially out. So ironically, it's this government and this Knesset will see fewer settlers than in the past. It will also see a sharp reduction in the ultra-Orthodox representation. By all accounts, Shas and United Torah Judaism together will not have more than 13 seats. Now that's a reduction from 17, even over that in the past few Knesset. So I don't think it serves us well if we don't analyze very carefully who is being represented, who feels underrepresented, and what shifts have occurred. These are subtle shifts, but they're not necessarily shifts that move strongly to the right or to extreme right-wing positions, on the one hand, okay? On the other hand, if you're looking for a reason to understand that Israeli society is deeply divided politically, it is. These elections prove that once again, and frankly, very disturbing kinds of ways. So that's my first point, believe it or not. And my second point is very, again, I just want to repeat, is very brief. I'm not sure that the turnout rate in the periphery was greater than it was in the more secular, liberal parts of the country. I'm going to have to analyze that when the final votes are in and when my insomnia reaches new peaks and my coughing stops.
Thank you. One more from the floor.
There seems to often new parties in Israel that do really well in their sort of first election, but in the second election they kind of fizzle out. But it looks like Yesh Atid has managed to defy that kind of trend. Just wondering if you give a bit of analysis about Yesh Atid and if you think Yair Lapid will indeed one day be Prime Minister of Israel?
There's what's known in Israel as balloon parties or atmosphere parties, or sometimes in English they're called boutique or niche parties, etc. The two key ones in these elections were Kahlon's Kulanu party, even though nobody quite remembers the name of the party, and Yesh Atid, once again with Yair Lapid. These parties are not really parties, with all due respect. And that's directly addressing your question. They're not really parties for the simple reason that they rely entirely on the person who's leading them, who has complete control of the composition of the list. And if you remove the head of the party, there is nothing really very much that brings the people together after the leader. There's no leader, no party. So they, again, in Hebrew, we use the term balloon party. Now, Yesh Atid survived its first re-election, right? It survived its first re-election very much the way Kadima, after Ehud Olmert left, survived its re-election, actually did very well indeed in the 2009 elections, actually came out as the largest party under Tzipi Livni. It petered out in 2013 and totally disappeared today. Shinui in the past, Dash in the past, these are all center parties with very similar characteristics to Yesh Atid under Yair Lapid. Same process, same dynamic. If I may, what we see is a big surge on the political scene. First time re-election, lose. If Yair Lapid is not part of the government, and then again, I put a great question mark out of it, around it, because I'm not sure that he's capable of being in the opposition. And he may surprise many of his supporters in the next few weeks, surprise negatively, by the way. But by and large, I don't see a party there yet. And using all these signs at the moment, with all due respect to Yair Lapid, and with very great respect to much of his electorate, I don't see the institutionalization of the party, that party at the moment. What it does highlight, and I keep repeating it all the time, is that about a quarter of Israeli voters are really center. They're not right, and they're really not left. They're center. It may be closer to 30%. And as the parties that express this position rise and fall and rise and fall, time and time again, that electoral block is very, very persistent on the Israeli political scene, and it will not disappear, but somebody will come in instead of Lapid, just like Yair Lapid took over essentially in the new guise from his late father, Tommy Lapid, who was the head of Shinui 20 years ago.
And Naomi, for the last question, I think I'll merge a couple of the online questions together. And there is a theme around what will happen with Palestinians on one side of the green line vis-a-vis the peace process. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is given that there may be a stronger focus on domestic policy in this next government, and maybe the need for Bibi Netanyahu to find a new enemy on the domestic front, is how that will relate to Palestinian citizens of Israel, particularly about price tag attacks, and this is one of NIF's focus areas of creating a shared society, and whether that will be impacted on by the new government.
Okay, very, very good questions. I think that a lot of the anti-Arab attacks will persist, but they'll be somewhat attenuated because the Arab voice is stronger, and the patience of many Israelis is also much attenuated. But frankly, the big struggles, and you put it very well, Liam, in the questions, or whoever asked the questions, the big struggle, the struggle over democracy in Israel will persist. The struggle over tolerance in Israel will persist. The struggle against racism in Israel will persist. There are stronger forces who will join this struggle, but official Israel will use these tools when it sees fit, as it has in the past. And therefore, if one thinks ahead in terms of what civil society can and should do in the future, the emphasis on democracy, on the struggle against racism, on the struggle against isolation of various segments of Israeli society, those key issues will continue, unfortunately, unabated in the next few years.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time now. It's been wonderful to have you with us, and I know you've had a very long night and battling a nasty cough, so I'd like you to know how appreciative we are that you took the time to share your knowledge and your insights. Please help in.